Hi, boys and girls. Okay, so this is going to be the end of your story. I am going to read 3 chapters, and after that, the book is over. It's all done. So we're going to read chapter 29, Nancy. Nancy had big hands and big feet. He didn't like his name. He thought it was a girl's name. None of the other children in Mrs. Jewell's class thought that Nancy's name was odd. They didn't think of it as a girl's name or as a boy's name. Nancy was just the name of a quiet kid with big hands and big feet who sat over in the corner next to John. Nancy was very quiet and shy. He was ashamed of his name. He had only one friend, a girl who went to class on the 23rd story of Wayside School. They were friends for a good reason. He didn't know her name, and she didn't know his. They just called each other, "Hey, you," or just plain, "you." Nancy was afraid to ask his friend what her name was, because then he might have to tell her what his name was. He never could figure out why she never asked, but he was happy just to leave well enough alone. One morning, Nancy and his friend were late. When they got to the 23rd story, his friend's teacher was waiting outside. "Hurry up, you're late, Mac," said the teacher. Nancy's friend turned red. She didn't move. "Come on, Mac, shake a leg. Get the lead out," said the teacher. "Your name is Mac?" said Nancy. Mac was very pretty. She had red hair and freckles. She covered her face and ran into the room. "My name is Nancy," Nancy called after her. Mac stepped back outside. "I was ashamed to tell you my name," she said. "Me too," said Nancy. "Nancy's a girl's name." "Oh, I think it's cute," said Mac. "Well, I like the name Mac," said Nancy. "Mac is a boy's name," said Mac. "My mother has a rich aunt named Nancy," said Nancy. "That's why she gave me that name." "My mother once had a dog named Mac," said Mac. "Hey, do you want to trade?" Nancy asked. "Can we?" asked Mac. "I don't see why not," said Nancy. "Okay," said Mac. They both spun around 100 times in opposite directions until they were so dizzy they fell over. When they stood up, Mac was Nancy and Nancy was Mac. They said goodbye, then Mac raced up to Mrs. Jewell's room. He was no longer shy. "Hi, everybody, my name's Mac," he announced. "I traded names." He held out his big hand. Todd jumped up and shook it. "Hi, Mac," he said. "Glad to meet you." "How's it going, Mac?" said Ron. "Howdy, Mac," said Terrence. "Nice to meet you, Mac," said BB. "You traded names?" asked Jason. Jason didn't like his name either. "That's right." "Jason, old boy," said Mac. "Is that allowed?" asked Jason. "Why not?" said Mac. "Hey, anybody want to trade?" Jason called. "I'll trade you," said Terrence. He didn't like his name either. "Wait, I'll trade you," Terrence said Mauricia. Mauricia didn't like her name. "No, he's trading with me," said Jason. "I'll trade with you, Mauricia," said Damien. "No thanks," said Mauricia. "I'll trade with you, Damien," said Mrs. Jewels. "No, I want to be Mrs. Jewels," said Stephen. It turned out that nobody in Mrs. Jewels' class liked their name. The children all spun around different directions till they all got so dizzy that they fell over. And when they stood up again, nobody knew who anybody was. "What are we doing, Mrs. Jewels?" asked Leslie, who was really Eric Bacon. "My name's not Mrs. Jewels, it's Mauricia," answered Terrence, who was really Jason. "It's not. I'm Mauricia," said Dee Dee, who was really Joe. "You're both wrong," said Mauricia. "I'm Mrs. Jewels." This went on for an hour. At last they figured out who the real Rondi was. She was missing her 2 front teeth. After they figured out Rondi, they were able to get Allison pretty easily, and then from there they got DJ, Damien, and Mrs. Jewels. She was the oldest one. Eventually they figured out who everybody really was. They had some difficulty deciding which Eric was which, and actually, they're still not absolutely sure. Everybody just decided to keep his own name. The children didn't like them, but it made things much easier. Mac and Nancy kept their names. But when they were together, they still called each other "Hey You" or just plain "You." All right, next chapter, Stephen. Stephen had green hair. He had purple ears and a blue face. He wore his sister's pink dancing shoes and green leotard. The leotards matched his hair. He was all dressed up as a goblin for Mrs. Jewls' Halloween party. But unfortunately, it wasn't Halloween. "Ha ha ha! You look so silly," said Jason. Jason was Stephen's best friend. "So do you," said Stephen. "Boy, are you silly," said Jenny. "Halloween is on Sunday. Today is only Friday." "You're the one who's silly," said Stephen. "Ha ha, you'd probably come to school on Sunday. Mrs. Jewls said we'd have the party today, but none of the other children wore costumes, only Stephen." "All right, class," said Mrs. Jewls. "It's time for a Halloween party." "See," said Stephen. Mrs. Jewls gave each child a cookie that looked like an orange witch with a hat. She laughed when she saw Stephen and forgot to give him one. Stephen didn't ask for it. He was afraid she'd laugh again. The children finished their cookies in less than 30 seconds. "All right, class," said Mrs. Jewls. "The party is over. We have a lot of work to do." Stephen felt like a fool. The party lasted less than a minute, and he had to spend the rest of the day wearing his silly goblin suit. "Look, Stephen's wearing his sister's leotard," laughed Dana. "They're green, just like his hair." Everybody laughed. Mrs. Jewls began the arithmetic lesson. She wrote on the blackboard, 2 + 2 = 5. "That's wrong," shouted Joy. Mrs. Jewls tried again. 2 + 2 = 3. That wasn't right either. She added 2 and 2 again and got 43. It was useless. No matter how hard she tried, she could not get 2 + 2 to = 4. "I don't understand it," she said. "They've always equaled 4 before." Suddenly she screamed. The chalk turned into a squiggly worm. She dropped it on her foot. Then all the lights went out and the blackboard lit up like a movie screen. A woman appeared on the screen. She had a long tongue and pointed ears. She stepped off the screen and into the classroom. It was the ghost of Mrs. Gorf. Mrs. Gorf ran her fingernails across the blackboard. "Trick or treat, you rotten kids," she said. "Now I'll get even with you at last. Where's Todd?" "Who is that?" asked Mrs. Jewls. "Mrs. Gorf," said Damien. "Who's Mrs. Gorf?" asked Mrs. Jewls. "She was the meanest teacher we ever had," said Rondi. "What happened to her?" asked Mrs. Jewls. "Louise ate her," said Jason. "Well, I'm not going to allow this," said Mrs. Jewls. "Get out of my classroom," she demanded. "It's Halloween, sweet teacher," said Mrs. Gorf. "Ghosts can go anywhere they like. I've come for a little class reunion." "But it isn't Halloween," said Mrs. Jewls. "Halloween is still 2 days away." "I know," said Mrs. Gorf, "but Halloween falls on a Sunday this year, so we're celebrating it on Friday before." Stephen leaped up from his seat. "See, I was right," he said. "Today is the day we celebrate it, the Friday before. Mrs. Gorf proved it." He ran up to Mrs. Gorf. They all laughed at me and made me feel silly because I was only one who was dressed up. But they were the ones who were wrong. You and I are right. He put his arms around Mrs. Gorf and hugged her. Mrs. Gorf gasped and disappeared. The lights came back on. Mrs. Jewls picked up the piece of chalk from the floor. She wrote on the blackboard, 2 + 2 = 4. "Ah, that's good enough," she said. "When 2 + 2 doesn't equal 4, anything can happen." All the children who had laughed at Stephen now called him a hero, but they told him to change his outfit because he looked silly. So at lunch, Stephen went home, washed up, and changed. He came back wearing blue jeans and a polo shirt. Of course, his hair was still green. It always was. All right, last chapter. This is chapter 30, Luis, or Lewis, however you want to pronounce it. Luis had a red face and a mustache of many colors. He was the art teacher at Wayside School. It was his job to see that the children didn't have too much fun during recess and lunch. And if you haven't already guessed it, he is the one who wrote this book. One June 10th, there was a blizzard. Luis was afraid that the children would have too much fun, so nobody was allowed outside. "Class," said Mrs. Jewls, "after you finish your lunch today, come back to the classroom. You are not allowed outside." The children all went to the lunchroom. Miss Mush had made tuna surprise. They looked at it, then hurried back upstairs. There was nothing to do. "Now, class," said Mrs. Jewls, "I know that you are all bored, but I have a special surprise for you." "I hope it's better than the tuna surprise," said Mauricia. Mrs. Jewls continued, "Luis is going to come up and entertain us. He will tell us a story. Now, I want you all to be on your best behavior." When Luis walked in, all the children booed. "Are you going to tell us a story?" asked Bibi. "Yes," said Luis. "Well, it better be good," Bibi warned. "It better be better than the tuna surprise," said Butterfingers. "I thought the tuna surprise was good," said Luis. "You'd eat dirt if they put enough ketchup on it," said Mac. "Hey, everybody, be quiet," said Todd. "Let him tell the story." "Not too loud, Luis," said Sherry. "I'm trying to get some sleep." Luis sat in the middle of the room, and all the children gathered round. Luis began his story. "This is a story about school, very much like this one. But before we get started, there's something you ought to know so that you don't get confused. In this school, every classroom is on the same story." "Which one, the 18th?" asked Jenny. "No," said Luis. "They're all on the ground. The school is only one story high." "Not much of a school," laughed Damien. Luis continued. "Now, you might think that the children were all strange and silly. That's probably true. However, when I told them stories about you, they thought you were strange and silly." "Us?" the children answered. "How are we strange?" "I'm normal," said Stephen. "Aren't I?" "As normal as I am," Joe assured him. "The children at that school must be crazy," said Leslie. "Real Lulus," Mauricia agreed. "Tell us about them, Luis," Bibi demanded. "For one thing," Luis said, "none of these children have ever been turned into an apple." "Well, that's silly," said Dee Dee. "Everybody's been turned into an apple. It's a part of growing up." Luis continued. "Dead rats don't walk into classrooms wearing raincoats." "What do they wear, tuxedos?" asked Todd. "And the girls never try to sell their toes," Luis added. "Well, no wonder," said Leslie. "At today's prices?" Luis continued. "They don't trade names or read upside down. They can't turn mosquito bites into numbers, and they can't count their hairs on their head. The walls don't laugh, and 2 + 2 always equals 4. "How horrible," said Damien. "That's not the worst of it," said Luis. "They have never tasted Mauricia-flavored ice cream." A hush fell over the classroom. "Mrs. Jules, I'm scared," said Allison. "Is there really a school like that?" "Of course not," said Mrs. Jules. "Luis is just telling you a story." "It was a good story," said Leslie. "I thought it was silly," said Kathy. "I liked it," said Rondi. "It was funny." Mrs. Jules said, "Luis, it's a very entertaining story. But we don't really go in for fairy tales here. I'm trying to teach my class the truth." "That's all right," said Luis. "I have to go down to room 29 now and tell them a story." He started out the door. "Class," said Mrs. Jules, "let's all thank Luis for his wonderful story." Everybody booed. All right. That's the story. I hope that you guys enjoyed that, and I'm so glad that I got to do a read aloud with you guys while we were on NTI and doing distance learning, because I know this was a really fun part of our classroom. So